Here we are again. Light in August, Lecture 5, the last lecture of the semester. Well, after the agonized Gale Hightower orders Byron and the Hineses out of his house at the end of Chapter 16, Faulkner performs a narrative maneuver at the start of Chapter 17 that we have seen in as a kind of recurrent structural principle in the novel. He tells us, quote, "That was Saturday night. Lena's child was born the next morning." Once again, Faulkner announces an important event in the advancing fictional present, and then, having announced it, devotes many pages to looping back in time in order to explain how that event came to pass, rather than explaining it at that moment. Now, we saw this early in the novel when we hear, for example, that Joanna Burton was murdered, and then we get a detailed account of the events leading up to it after that announcement. And we also get this technique at the end of Chapter 18 when Byron Bunch learns from a man on the road that Joe Christmas has been killed an hour earlier, after which we then loop back in time to an account of how Joe escaped, fled to Hightower's house, and was shot to death by Percy Grimm. Well, I've noted that this method often causes delayed information, delays that make the reader speculate and hypothesize before we find out exactly how and why things have happened. But the technique I'm describing of announcing something and then looping back in time to explain how it came to be also has the effect of making us read the detailed descriptions, say, of Lena's childbirth or of Joe Christmas's death that come after the announcement, reading them with a sense that they are predestined for us as they are for the characters, because we have already heard the outcome in advance. Now, in this sense, as I've suggested, Faulkner's method of circling back in time reinforces our awareness of the deterministic forces of the past that govern the lives, to one degree or another, that govern the destinies of all of the characters. This narrative technique of circling back in time from a moment in the fictional present also reinforces the trope of circularity that we see also in the physical movements of the characters. Joe Christmas, on the run, feels himself caught in a circle and instinctively comes back in the course of his life to encounter Hines, the man who abducted him as an infant. And we see that Byron repeatedly tries to leave Lena but always circles back to her as his irresistible center of gravity, even in the last section of the novel. Well, sometimes the circling I've described within the character's actions and narratively reflects the futility in this novel, reflects a sense of one's inability ever to escape the familial and racial past, as with Joe Christmas, whose wanderings throughout the course of the novel really amount to a kind of absurd orbit in which he can't escape from those forces of the past compacted and compounded within himself, something that Joe realizes, we saw last time, as he is riding into Mottstown and reflects upon the circularity of his life. But at other times in Light in August, circular movement can be productive and can advance an individual's life and can even express some small measure of freedom, as it does with Byron, and as we'll see more emphatically with Hightower, who leaves his house to deliver Lena's baby and then returns, circles back home, a changed man, only to go back to the cabin a few hours later and return home again. Now, this circularity, in the case of Hightower, reveals progression and change within him. It isn't a sign, as it is in Monsay, of a larger mythic structure of recurrence in life, of the kind we find in the circular trope in the Magic Mountain, in which Hans circles in the snow just before his revelatory dream, or the circlet that Papercorn makes with his fingers, or even the circular ruff that Hans's grandsire wears. No, there's no mythic or mystical meaning in the productive circularity we get at times in Light in August. It's productive within the characters' individual lives, but it has no larger mythic significance beyond that. Still, it's not always circularity as absurdity. Now, you remember that on the day that Lena gives birth, Hightower had been awakened that morning by Byron, just 6 hours after Hightower had ordered Byron to leave the house in anger. And Byron, coming back, asks Hightower to ride his mule to the cabin and bring with him the book that Hightower had used some years before to deliver the stillborn baby of a black woman. Well, Hightower arrives before the doctor does, whom Byron also stirs into action. And in acting to serve Lena, a woman whose out-of-wedlock pregnancy Hightower had disapproved of, in doing so, Hightower commits himself to involvement in the world of the present from which he has so long retreated. This is his first gesture of reconnection. The only other people there at the cabin are the Hineses. Mrs. Hines is watching her demented husband very closely because she knows that old Hines plans to make his way into Jefferson in an attempt to kill Joe. But when Lena's child is born, the old woman loses her bearings in a compensatory fantasy. Having found her lost grandson, Joe Christmas, only to learn that he may die for a murder, and having been forced to relive the death of her daughter in childbirth when she tells the story to Hightower, Mrs. Hines now tries to rewrite the unbearable past by seeing Lena as her dead daughter Millie and seeing the newborn baby as Joe. As she puts it, it's my Millie's little boy. The doctor looks on in a state of bafflement. The doctor saw that her face was not stupid or vacuous. He saw that at the same time it was both peaceful and terrible, as though the peace and the terror had both died long ago and had come to live again at the same time. But he remarked mainly her attitude at once like a rock and like a crouching beast. She said in a whisper at once cunning and tense with fading terror, "I fooled him. I told him you would come in the back way this time. I fooled him. But now you are here. You can see to Millie now. I'll take care of Joey." Then this faded from her face. She believes that she's fooled her husband somehow by preserving this child whom she imagines is the newborn Joe Christmas. Now, Mrs. Hines' fantasy of reliving and changing a decisive moment in the past provides for her not just an illusory restoration of what was lost, and what indeed is about to be lost again with Joe Christmas's death, but it also provides for her a brief escape from the guilt that the woman has lived with for 25 years, guilt for having left the infant Joe alone just long enough for her husband to abduct him and take him to the orphanage. It is no wonder that Lena tells Hightower that Mrs. Hines frightens her, especially when the old woman clutches her newborn child and is reluctant to let him go, imagining that it is Joe. Well, the effect on Hightower of delivering a live child this time, and doing so just before the doctor walks in the cabin door, and doing it this time not through a cesarean, which was of a stillborn child, but delivering the child naturally out of Lena's body. The effect of this on Hightower is transformative. He walks this heavy, sagging man 2 miles back to his house, prepares himself breakfast, and we're told he moved like a man with a purpose who for 25 years had been doing nothing. Now, a sense of purpose and vitality has returned. He stops quite still, clicking his tongue as though in displeasure. I ought to feel worse than I do, Hightower thinks. But he has to admit that he does not. And as he stands tall, misshapen, lonely in his lonely and ill-kept kitchen, holding in his hand an iron skillet in which yesterday's old grease is bleakly caked, there goes through him a glow, a wave, a surge of something almost hot, almost triumphant. I show them, he thinks. Life comes to the old man yet. While they get there too late, I deliver the baby. And then he thinks, what if I do? What if I do feel it? Triumph and pride. What if I do? But the warmth, the glow, evidently does not regard or need buttressing either. Neither is it quenched by the actuality of an orange and eggs and toast. No. Even the quotidian breakfast doesn't diminish the sense of accomplishment and pleasure Hightower feels. So revitalized is Hightower that it's clear that the birth of Lena's child marks his own rebirth as a human being. Quote, life comes to the old man, he tells himself. Now, I'd suggested that within the novel's structure, Hightower not only tries to assist both Lena and Joe Christmas, but that structurally he also mediates between the two opposing conceptual poles that those characters embody. So, on a day when Joe Christmas experiences the death that he longs for, and the same day when Lena delivers a live baby that she has carried for 9 months, Hightower experiences himself not only these two moments, but in the course of that day experiences a movement from death into life. That is, a movement from the state of death in life that had marked his existence for 25 years into a vital present and back into the human community. It is this movement that constitutes a rare act of agency, of free will within the largely deterministic structure of a novel in which the paralyzing force of the past destroys Joanna Burden and Joe Christmas and arrests the development of most of the other characters. So exhilarated is Hightower by his immersion into life that he now looks forward to what Byron will ask of him next, rather than fearing it as he has. We're told, just to learn whatever Byron can think or want me to do will be worth staying awake for. This from the man who had thrown Byron out of his house the previous night. Now, when Hightower goes back that day to the cabin to look in on Lena, after Mrs. Hines has followed her husband back into Jefferson, Hightower recalls Joanna Burden's death and regrets that Joanna didn't live a week longer to see this newborn life on her property, as he imagines it, to see how luck and life returned to these barren acres. Well, Hightower also, in coming to Lena, overcomes his distrust of women and female sexuality, rooted in his own failed marriage and his own guilty contribution to it. He overcomes it enough to tell the out-of-wedlock pregnant mother, Lena, quote, "You're a good woman, will be. That is, you will be a good woman when someone marries you." But whom? Well, Hightower notices that Lena has combed her hair after having given birth and is clearly awaiting someone. That someone is almost certainly Byron Bunch, whom he has also praised and whom he now tells Lena is a good man. Yet, Hightower, who had earlier cautioned Byron to give up Lena and go away, now urges her not to accept him as her husband. He says this even before Lena tells Hightower that Byron has indeed proposed to her 5 days earlier, though Byron did not mention that to Hightower. Lena refused him then and says she would refuse him again, presumably because she is still waiting for Lucas Birch to turn up and honor his promise to her. But as Lena talks to Hightower, she betrays unmistakably a regret for declining Byron's offer. Well, the ever-dutiful Byron told her that he would arrange for the sheriff to bring Birch to the cabin, with Birch little knowing that what he would find there was Lena Grove and the baby. And Byron has refused her invitation immediately after the birth to look at the newborn baby. Lena reads this as a sign that he is going to leave her. So, expecting, as she talks to Hightower, that once again, the man who impregnated her, Lucas Birch, is going to desert her again, as he inevitably does, and fearing that Byron will leave, Lena now faces the prospect of having no man at all, and for a moment her usual serenity gives way to tears as she seems to regret saying no to Byron. And he went away. He said, when I said, come here and look at him, and look at me, standing there by the door, he said, I come to find out when you want to see him. And I said, see who? And he said, they may have to send a deputy for him. That is Lucas Birch. Oh, and then Byron went away. He just stood there and went away while he watches her with that despair, Hightower does, of all men in the presence of female tears. Lena begins to cry. She sits upright, the child at her breast, crying, not loud and not hard, but with a patient and hopeless abjectness, not hiding her face. And you worry about if I said no or not, and I already said no, and you worry me, and now he's already gone. I will never see him again. And he, Hightower, sits there, and she bows her head at last, and he rises and stands over her with his hand on her bowed head, thinking, thank God, God help me, thank God, God help me. When Hightower leaves Lena, you'll note, his response to the idea of Lena marrying Byron is to thank God that it appears that that's not going to happen. But I think we'll find that his response to that prospect is more complicated and conflicted than it appears. Hightower is not as certain as he had been earlier about the wrongness of that union. Earlier, he had emphatically instructed Byron, remember, to give up Lena both for moral and practical reasons. Morally, because she was another man's woman. Practically, because he felt that Lena would destroy him. He wanted Byron to protect himself from this woman who became pregnant by another man and for whom Hightower felt such distrust. Still, he thanks God then that Byron, it appears, has been sent away, and that Byron, in fact, will, as Lena fears, not be coming back to her, that he has given up on Lena. And indeed, because Byron regards the two of them as inherently incompatible, he still is trying to protect his friend by advising Lena and Hightower to stay away from one another. Lena and Byron to stay away from one another. Hightower foresees unhappiness in the prospective possibility of a union between this sexually experienced young woman and a virginal middle-aged man, a man whom Lena could never devote the necessary love to, so Hightower thinks, because Byron, if he were to marry her, would have to compete not just with another man's child, but also, Hightower thinks, he would have to compete with Lena's lingering emotional and sexual attachment to Lucas Birch. Thus, he suggests, as he reflects upon this and looks down, she does not look away. Let him go, he says to Lena. Send him away from you. They look at one another. Send him away, daughter. You are probably not much more than half his age, but you have already outlived him over twice. He will never overtake you, catch up with you, because he's wasted too much time. And that, too, his nothing, is irredeemable as your all. He can no more cast back and do than you can cast back and undo. You have a man-child that is not his, by a man that is not him. You will be forcing into his life two men and only the third part of a woman. Well, when Hightower leaves Lena, he feels a sense of, quote, exultation at the thought that indeed Byron is leaving town, and he's pleased when he hears that Byron has quit his job because he thinks that it will save Byron the agony of trying to be with Lena Grove, with whom he suggests there is simple incompatibility. All of this is consistent with his earlier admonition to Byron to stay away from her. But I noted he has begun to question that in certain ways, because on the other hand, shortly before the speech that I just read, in which he advises Lena that she and Hightower are simply incompatible, just before that, Hightower had envisioned a future, almost a destiny, in which he saw Lena bearing more children, indeed bearing children by Byron. And in this rather contented fantasy, he thinks, that child that I have delivered, she will have others, more of them, many more. That will be her life, her destiny. She's clearly an earth mother. The good stock, peopling in tranquil obedience to it, the good earth, from these hearty loins, without hurry or haste descending, mother and daughter, but by Byron engendered next. Poor boy. Almost as if, yes, well, for better or for worse, that's what's going to happen. But it doesn't seem as if Hightower is imagining this, foreseeing this destiny with any sense of regret. Thus, the sense of uncertainty. Now, ironically, neither Hightower nor Lena really understand why it is that Byron is planning to leave Jefferson. It is not because of Lena's refusal. That's not what has driven him away. As we have seen and will see, Byron Bunch is inexhaustibly persistent with both Hightower and with Lena. Nor is it that he is leaving because he is simply following Hightower's stern ethical advice to get out of town and save yourself, man. No. The fact is that Byron's decision to leave comes to him suddenly on the day of Lena's delivery, when something lurking in his mind that he had repressed suddenly, quote, springs full-clawed upon him. What is it? Well, it is paradoxically his realization that this woman who is about to have a baby is not a virgin. Byron recognizes that even when he moved Lena into the cabin so that she would be comfortable and safe in her confinement, that clearly she was pregnant, and she got pregnant by sexual means. And yet some part of his mind had disavowed that fact, had disavowed the idea that Lena would in fact actually deliver a baby, and that she had actually gotten pregnant because she'd had sex with Lucas Birch. In short, this is another instance of that paradoxical state of cognitive dissonance we see in Faulkner's characters, in which one holds in suspension two completely incompatible feelings or ideas. Byron knows and yet doesn't know that this is a sexualized woman, in much the same way that Joe Christmas knew and yet didn't know or refused to know that women menstruate. And just as Lena knows and doesn't know that Lucas Birch is a scoundrel who will never honor his promise to her. Faulkner describes her particular cognitive dissonance when a little bit earlier he tells us that it was like she was in two parts in her mind, and one of them knows that he, Birch, is a scoundrel, but the other part believes that when a man and a woman are going to have a child, that the Lord will see that they are all together when the right time comes. Now, note that the truth about Lena's sexuality for Byron descends upon him at a particular instant when he hears Lena beginning to scream in labor. Suddenly, the sound of that labor, the unmistakable physical fact that she is now about to have a child, causes him to think this way. He knew now why he neglected to engage a doctor beforehand. It is because he did not believe until Mrs. Hines called him from the tent that she would need one, would ever have that need, even though clearly part of his mind knew that she was having a baby. And thus, in the face of this realization of the baby coming and the sexual means by which it got there, we're told, with stern, austere astonishment, Byron thought, or did not so much think as in italics, the content of his feeling was this: it was like it was not until Mrs. Hines called me and I heard her and saw her face and knew that Byron Bunch was nothing in this world to her right then that I found out that she is not a virgin. Well, I'll have to tell now. I'll have to go and tell Lucas Birch. It was not unsurprised now. It was something like the terrible and irremediable despair of an adolescent in Byron. Why I didn't even believe until now that it was so, that he was so. Yes, it ain't until now that I ever believed that he is Lucas Birch, that there ever was a Lucas Birch, that she ever had sex, that she ever became pregnant by Lucas Birch. Now, a moment later, Byron decides that instead of hiding Lena from Lucas Birch or failing to inform Lucas Birch of the childbirth, that he must now bring Birch, a.k.a. Brown, to Lena, both because it is the man's right and duty as the child's father to see that child, but also he comes to this resolution, Byron does, as a way of punishing himself for what he realizes was his self-delusion, in which he loved Lena so naively and unrealistically as if she were a virgin. He's embarrassed at the very idea that he had deluded himself so thoroughly. Well, beyond the guilt that I have described and the sense of humiliation at his own self-blinding, Byron is also leaving because of the shame that he feels he must endure in the eyes of the town, a town he has scandalized by sequestering himself on Joanna Burden's property with a pregnant woman out there alone with her, largely in the woods for some time. Now, when he thinks about how he'll be perceived, we're told that the quiet little man who for 7 years had been a minor mystery to the town and who had been for 7 days well nigh a public outrage and affront began to realize how they have seen him. And the problem, he realizes, is not with the town's women. Mrs. Beard, who keeps the boarding house where he took Lena, Mrs. Beard assures him that don't mean anything when they, the women, gossip, but rather, she realizes, and tells him, it is the danger of Byron's demeaning status in the eyes of the male community, a male community that Mrs. Beard says takes talking seriously. And Byron knows this. He imagines then the voices of the town's men, which echo bitterly in his head as he conceives of them saying things like this: Byron Bunch, that weeded another man's laid-by crop without any havers. The fellow that took care of another man's whore while the other fellow was busy making $1,000 and got nothing for it. Byron Bunch, that protected her good name when the woman that owned the good name and the man she'd given it to had both thrown it away, and that got the other fellow's bastard born in peace and quiet in Byron Bunch's expense and heard a baby cry once for his pay, got nothing for it except the permission to fetch the other fellow back to her soon. As he hears in his mind or imagines this derision of him as a fool and a patsy and as a tool, he says, and now I can go away, he thought. I got to go somewhere, he thought. Yes, I have to get out of here. I cannot face the opprobrium of this humiliation among the male community. Well, Hightower expects that before Byron leaves town, he will at least visit him again to press him on that other moral issue and that other request that Byron had made, having to do with the status of Joe Christmas, whom you recall Byron had asked Hightower to save by providing through a lie an alibi an alibi that would free Joe from the charge of killing Joanna Burton and, for that matter, of being her lover. Now, exhilarated by his rebirth in the world, Hightower feels that Byron has restored to me myself, and so he awaits for his friend to arrive so that he, Hightower, can undertake, quote, that one more thing reserved, that is, the thing involving Joe Christmas. Well, Byron has indeed restored Hightower's life by activating his conscience, painful though that was. But again, note that Hightower foresees, as he had earlier, the inevitability of Joe Christmas's death and recognizes in advance the injustice of that death. He condemns it, having never met the man. We're told that with his hands clasped behind him, Hightower paces in the house, thinking quietly, peacefully, sadly, poor man, poor fellow, no man can be justified in taking human life, least of all a warranted officer, a sworn servant of his fellow man. When it is sanctioned publicly in the person of an elected officer, who knows that he has not himself suffered at the hands of his victim? Call the victim by what name you will. How can we expect an individual to refrain when he believes that he has suffered at the hands of his victim? Well, he knows that this one thing reserved for him will be to combat in any way necessary, even by a lie, this injustice. But consider it for a moment in the passage I just read. For Hightower, Joe's situation is doubly unjust and tragic. First, for Hightower, and I think for Faulkner, the duty of public officials that Hightower mentions is not to take lives, but rather to preserve them. Second, and more important, Hightower knows that while Joe has victimized Joanna Burton, or at least is accused of it, that Joe is himself a victim of the white world of which Joanna was a part. Without ever having seen Joe Christmas, Hightower understands the burden of oppression under which such a man of mixed race must labor his entire life. A man who is said to be part black. His clasped hands behind him as he walks and thinks, Hightower's, recall Joe Christmas's handcuffs. And we're reminded in that image that the two men, who meet only briefly once, actually have much in common within the novel's oscillating interreflections. They are both self-isolating individuals. They are both suspicious and embittered about women. They are both haunted by their childhood pasts, as we'll see when we get Hightower's full backstory. As Hightower waits for Byron to arrive, his friend is already on the road going out of town. Byron watches the deputy bring Lucas Birch into Lena's cabin and then starts to ride his mule away, telling himself, quote, a man can just about bear anything. This is agonizing for him to be separated from the woman he loves, but he can bear it, he says. Ironically, in saying that, he is, of course, exhibiting that quality of quiet endurance that he loved most in Lena, the woman that he is leaving and whom he now resembles as he goes off on the same road out of town, which is the road by which she, at the beginning of the novel, had arrived. But Byron pauses on this journey out of Jefferson one last time to look from the top of a hill down at the cabin, from the top of this rise, and what does he see? He sees Lucas Birch running away out of the cabin. At this, Byron loops back, circles around, and goes off in pursuit of Lucas Birch. This, too, is a decision that descends upon him immediately and instinctively. Byron watches a man, it appears, as though by magic at the rear of the cabin, already running, in the act of running out from the rear of the cabin, while the unsuspecting deputy sits quiet and motionless on the front step. He sees Birch as a tiny figure flee across the barren slope behind the cabin toward the woods. And a change comes over Byron, who is resolved to leave. The desire of this moment is more than desire. It's a conviction, quiet and assured. Before he is aware that his brain has telegraphed his hand, he has turned the mule around from the road and is galloping along the ridge which parallels the running man's course when he entered the woods. He has not even named the man's name to himself. He does not speculate at all upon where the man is going or why, but nonetheless, it's clear that he is after him, and that this is a gesture of emphatic and decisive importance. Well, a moment later, we're told he thinks to himself, he's thinking, all I took care of this woman for him, and I born his child for him, and now there is one more thing I can do for him. I can't marry them. I ain't a minister, and I may not catch him because he's got a head start on me, and I may not whip him if I do because he's bigger than me, but I can try it. I can try to do it. What does Byron intend exactly in pursuing and confronting Lucas Birch? What is the it that he refers to when he says, I can try it? Well, ironically, Byron tells himself that he is doing this not for Lena so much, but for Birch, who he feels owes him already for taking care of Lena. Now, Byron doesn't seem to know fully himself why he is invested in this pursuit. Perhaps what he wants to do is force Birch to marry Lena, or perhaps he wants to stop him at least from fleeing. But mostly I think what he wants here is to punish Birch for abandoning twice the woman that Byron loves from the moment that he first saw her, and in punishing him to teach Lucas Birch a lesson that he needs to learn. That might be what he has in mind when he says, that's the thing I can do for him, to teach him this lesson. Well, Byron foresees from the start that any or all of these aims are likely to fail because he is the smaller of the two men and he may not catch him at all, but he proceeds anyway because he's really doing it, I think, not so much for Lucas Birch, but for himself and also for Lena as that, quote, one more thing that I can do, no matter how ineffectual the outcome, to try in some way either to bring this man back or to teach this man a lesson or to punish him for his dereliction. It would also be on behalf of Lena he is acting, though he doesn't articulate it that way to himself. Confronting Birch, then, is at once an act of revenge, an act of love, but also, it seems, an act of renunciation, because Byron does not intend to come back and replace Bunch at this point. He will either bring him back, he hopes, or else he will simply try to punish him for what he has done. But there's no suggestion that he at this point expects that he could in any way replace him. Thus, when they meet just beforehand, Byron says to himself, you've done thrown away twice inside of 9 months what I ain't had in 35 years. And now I'm going to get the hell beat out of me, and I don't care about that neither. And so he pursues him. And as he does, we're told, Byron had sprung upon his back without warning, with the blind and desperate valor of a starved and cornered rat. Birch fought. It lasted less than 2 minutes. And then Byron was lying quietly among the broken and trampled undergrowth, bleeding quietly about the face, hearing the underbrush crashing on, ceasing, fading into silence. He just lies there bleeding and quiet, knowing that after a while will be time enough to re-enter the world and to re-enter time. Now, once again, Faulkner refers to an event, in this case, Birch's flight from Lena's cabin, and then loops back in time to show us how it occurred. After learning that Lucas Birch has fled, we see the encounter in the cabin from Birch's perspective. He is suspicious when he's being led out to Joanna Burden's property, but he thinks he's being taken out of jail and being released in custody to collect a $1,000 reward. Instead, when they go out to Joanna's, he sees in the cabin Lena with his newborn infant, and he hears that, quote, a preacher has been to see her. And thus, fearing that he's going to be forced to marry her, Lucas starts to fabricate excuses, among other things, for his long absence. But Lena knows from the start that this is all a series of lies and inventions, and knows from the start that Lucas will, quote, have no more shame than to lie about why he didn't contact her, and he will offer her nothing but lies. When he does lie, we're told, his lying blew as trivial as leaves or trash. She doesn't trust now anything that he says. She responds to his predictably cowardly and comic departure when he, in fact, escapes out the window. She responds to it, as she does to almost everything, with a kind of resigned equanimity. She no longer expects anything from this man that one part of her mind had still tried to believe in until quite recently. When we are told that she says she must go out and pursue him, it's clear that this is not a matter of real conviction for her, but more a matter of habit than anything else. And then Lucas looked at her, stripped naked for the instant of verbiage and deceit. His voice was not much louder than a whisper. "It's a man outside in front waiting for me," he said. And then he was gone, through the window, without a sound, in a single motion, almost like a long snake. From beyond the window she heard a single faint sound as he began to run. Then only did she move, and then but to sigh once profoundly. "Now I got to get up again," she said aloud. Now, as Byron follows Birch to the railroad tracks, Birch tries to send a hilariously illiterate handwritten message to the sheriff, asking for the reward money through a black messenger. Fearing he'll lose a chance for the money by escaping town to avoid Lena, Lucas laments, quote, speaking of himself in the third person, "All Lucas Birch wanted was justice, just justice." Well, what Faulkner gives us here in the flight of this shallow, selfish fool is a grotesque parody of the situation of Joe Christmas on the run, the man that Lucas Birch betrayed, a man whose entire life of running has been a life of genuine injustice. Now, like Joe Christmas on the run, Lucas Birch feels trapped by forces that he cannot name, but which Faulkner refers to as, quote, an opponent who could read his moves. But unlike Joe, there is no part of Birch that wants to be caught and punished. No, he is moved only by a sense of flight from responsibility, nothing more. When Byron finally finds him in the passage I just read, we're told that Birch fights the smaller man with, quote, the desperate valor of a starved and cornered rat. And after beating Byron, Byron lies, quote, bleeding and quiet, words that deliberately recall Joe Christmas as he lay bleeding and quiet after he was beaten, you'll remember, in Max's house. And also note that in this same passage, Faulkner echoes Hightower. As Byron lies there bleeding, we're told he knows, quote, after a while he must re-enter the world and time. These verbal echoes that connect Byron with both Joe Christmas and Hightower again suggest connections among these three very different men, further instances of that interreflexive oscillation technique that I've described and that Faulkner uses in this sprawling novel to integrate his multiple protagonists and plots. It is only after Byron watches Lucas Birch hop on a train down the line that he gets to his feet and decides that he will return to Lena. And so he circles back to the woman and the cabin that he had left earlier, but now we're told he is uncertain of what he will do. But as Lena had at the start of the novel, and as Joe Christmas did before the murder, Byron in this moment experiences his future arrival at the cabin as if it had already occurred. So inevitable does it seem to him, so uncontrovertible is his love for Lena, that it's capable of overcoming his shame and guilt and her rejection of him, so that he already sees himself back there talking to her, appealing to her, even before he arrives. It was as though he has already and long since outstripped himself, already waiting at the cabin, even as he runs, until he can catch up and enter. And then I will stand there, I will. He tries it again. And then I will stand there, and I will. But he can get no further than that. And yet he does not give up, however. Even if I can't seem to get any further than that, when I will open the door and come in and stand there, and then I will look at her and look at her and look at her, the voice speaks again. Yes. Now, note that earlier Byron had refused, at Lena's request, to look at the baby, because that newborn signaled her carnal experience with another man, that part of Byron's dissociative brain had been trying to deny. Now, however, in returning, Byron accepts both Lena's sexuality and necessarily, in doing so, his own sexuality. Now he looks at the baby and accepts what it means. Well, when we begin the next chapter, Faulkner makes one of the most puzzling narrative moves in this always surprising novel. We learn that before Joe Christmas was killed, that he escaped from custody and took refuge in Hightower's house. And we wonder how and why did he escape, and why would he go, of all places, to the house of a cleric, given his dislike and his hatred of God and religion, particularly an ex-minister he did not know. Well, instead of providing more or less definitive answers, as he does in filling in other pieces of information, here, having announced this, Faulkner gives us the voice of a rather unreliable character, rather than the omniscient narrator, the voice of a new minor figure, the district attorney Gavin Stevens. And Stevens offers his own not entirely satisfactory theory in response to the question of how Joe Christmas managed to get loose and why he went to Hightower's. Stevens' perspective is on the whole less reliable than that of the furniture dealer, who we'll see at the end of the novel, who reports upon Lena and Byron's activities in the final chapter. Stevens is a member of the old Jefferson aristocracy. He's an educated man who tells an old college friend that he's picking up at the train station that Christmas must have met with Mrs. Hines, who feared that he would be, quote, burned or hacked to death by a vigilante mob instead of being executed by the state. And fearing this, she, in her meeting with Joe, must have encouraged him to break away while he was being led outside the jail, and encouraged him to run to Hightower's as a place of sanctuary. Well, when she saw him, Stevens theorizes, when Joe saw old Mrs. Hines, quote, 30 years were obliterated, and she told him all about the history of his birth, about his mother's death and abduction, thus motivating him to try to break away, or so he claims. Here's how he formulates it. That old outcast minister was a sanctuary which would be inviolable not only to officers and mobs, but to the very irrevocable past, to whatever crimes had molded and shaped Christmas, and left him at last high and dry in a barred cell with the shape of an incipient executioner everywhere he looked. And he believed her. I think that is what gave him not the courage so much as the passive patience to endure and recognize and accept the one opportunity which he had to break in the middle of that crowded square, manacled, and to run. But there was too much running with him, stride for stride with him, no pursuers but himself, years, acts, deeds, omitted and committed, keeping pace with him, stride for stride, breath for breath, thud for thud of the heart, using a single heart. It was not alone all those 30 years which she did not know, but all those successions of 30 years before that, which had put that stain either on his white blood or his black blood, whichever you will, and which killed him. Now, you'll note then that Stevens goes on to theorize about this theoretical conflict of white and black blood in Joe as he is in flight. But then the white blood drove him out there, as it was the black blood which snatched up the pistol, and the white blood which would not let him fire it. And it was the white blood which sent him to the minister, which, rising in him for the last and final time, sent him against all reason and all reality into the embrace of a chimera, a blind faith in something read in a printed book. Then I believe that the white blood deserted him for the moment, just a second, a flicker, allowing the black to rise in its final moment and make him turn upon that on which he had postulated his hope for salvation. It was the black blood which swept him by his own desire beyond the aid of any man, swept him up into that ecstasy out of a black jungle where life has already ceased before the heart stops and death is desire and fulfillment. And then the black blood filled him again, as it must have in crises such as this in his life. He did not kill the minister. He merely struck him with the pistol and ran on and crouched behind the table and defied the black blood for the last time, as he had been defying it for 30 years. He crouched behind that overturned table and let them shoot him to death with that loaded and unfired pistol in his hand. Now, this hypothesis, not only of what Joe did, but why he did it, is plausible but not convincing as a series of events, though certainly Stevens does understand that Joe is imprisoned by the force of history, not just his own 30 years, but the 30 years before that he was ever born and beyond. But where Stevens' theory breaks down is in his attempt, I think, to get inside the mind of Joe Christmas and to understand his motivation. And indeed, what frustrates Faulkner's reader at this point is that we do not return to Joe Christmas's point of view, nor does the omniscient narrator offer an explanation beyond the point of view of Gavin Stevens. We witness Joe Christmas's flight and death only from other perspectives. Well, Stephen is almost certainly right when he says that as Joe Christmas ran away, he was haunted by himself, by the acts and deeds he committed, but not just of his own lifetime, but rather what came before him, all the successions of 30 years which put a stain either on his white blood or his black blood. That is to say, Stevens understands the cumulative force of cultural history as well as Joe's childhood history as imprisoning elements within him that he can never run from. All of this is consistent with everything Faulkner has suggested about Joe, but Stevens takes far too schematic a view of Joe's mixed-race impulses, associating the white blood in him with the impulse to run to safety at the house of a man of God and not to kill, and associating Joe's black blood with the urge to kill others and himself. Although Joe had earlier himself associated his death wish with blackness, we have seen that in truth both his white and black strains of racial identity have caused Joe to inflict violence against others and against himself. Stevens' theory is too simplistic in that respect, and indeed there is a clear racist assumption underlying Stevens' account, this by a man whose own ancestors kept slaves. The idea that Joe's black blood alone drives him to want to kill and be killed is clearly a racist assumption. Now, Stevens' account is also unreliable because in his role as district attorney, he claims that Joe Christmas was going to plead guilty to the murder charge and that guilty plea would allow Joe to escape the death sentence and instead have life imprisonment. This is, in fact, what Stevens is hoping for. But knowing Joe Christmas, I think it's very unlikely, and I think Faulkner expects us to understand how unlikely it is, that Joe would ever accede to such a plea in order to save his life. Rather, Joe Christmas is a man who hates lies, such as anything that Stevens might want him to say to mitigate his guilt. But above all, he is an individual who does not want to live. He's an individual who wants to die. If admitting that he murdered Joanna Burton would remove the death penalty, then the only way Joe could be sure to die would be to escape and to be gunned down, as he is, though not gunned down by the sheriff, but rather by a vigilante racist, Percy Grimm. Nonetheless, one could argue that hypothetically the reason Joe runs is to ensure that he is killed rather than to run from death. and that ensuring that he would be killed is rooted not just in his long-standing desire, but in the threat, indeed, that he might in some way be imprisoned instead. Finally, there is this flaw in Stephen's theories. Stephen's, looking at Joe, views race essentialist in an essentialist way. Blackness is this. It is intrinsic. It is an impulse to violence against the world and one's self. But is race in any way essentialist? No. It's more of an idea. It is a concept. Joe wasn't even sure that he was black before he learns Mrs. Hines' story, but he had adopted it as an idea, as some aspect of himself. Race, then, Faulkner suggests, may be as much a kind of cultural construction or more than it is anything intrinsic as a set of habits or tastes or inclinations. But, of course, for Stevens, the implication is that there's black blood and there's white blood, and they have very distinctive desires and proclivities. Now, you might wonder why Faulkner gives such a flawed reporter here such a wide berth. As when the narrator, you recall, had earlier begun using the words maybe and perhaps to describe Joe's feelings, perhaps the reason Faulkner gives us this dubious and inconsistent and not entirely believable account from Stevens is that he wants to avoid any explicit or final verdict about Joe's interior life and feelings or motives. It is not just to keep the reader actively speculating, because I think we certainly do that, but it may also be at this point that he withholds certainty by giving us so much through Stevens, because, as one critic suggests, Faulkner is warning us that no schematic or even rational explanations of a character's behavior can ever penetrate to the core of the mystery of that individual's life. Well, Percy Grimm, Joe's executioner, if you will, is, like Doc Hines, a monstrous embodiment of racist hatred, marching under the imagined sanction of fundamentalist religion. But added to this in Percy Grimm's generation is something even more poisonous. In addition to the religious fundamentalism that justifies racism, there is the justification of rabid white nationalism. Taken together, then, the religion and the nationalism allow Grimm to feel that he can act outside the law because he feels that he has higher sanctions. Having missed the chance to fight in World War I, Grimm channels his desire to kill into the formation of a civilian militia, which, when Joe escapes, becomes a, quote, platoon, worked up to a pitch of racial hysteria under Grimm's irresistible and prophetic-like command. Note how deftly Faulkner here connects the cataclysm of the Great War with its rabid nationalism and vilification of the enemy and its invocations of Christian purpose, all aspects of the national sensibilities in Germany and France and elsewhere that fueled World War I, connects those elements with the racist violence that we see after the war in the American South. There, men like Percy Grimm channel the same feelings and the same justifications as rabid nationalists did during World War I. Indeed, Grimm even dresses his militia in uniforms and gains the town's support as a law unto himself, as if stirring a kind of nationalist, racist fervor in them. The town, we're told, had suddenly accepted Grimm with respect and perhaps a little awe and a deal of actual faith and confidence, as though somehow his vision and patriotism and pride in the town, the occasion, had been quicker and truer than theirs. His men, anyway, assumed and accepted this. After the sleepless nights and tenseness, the holiday, the suttee of the violation surrender, they were almost at a pitch where they might die for him if the occasion arose, under the cause of American patriotism, under the cause of Protestant fundamentalism and the need to dominate the black man, and under the need of out-and-out racism. Well, Joe Christmas's death comes to us, strangely, not through his eyes, but through the eyes of his killer. So once again, Faulkner deprives us of a clear or comprehensive understanding of Joe's feelings and motivations at this crucial time. After having spent so long in his perspective, in the last day of his life, we pull away from it. Now, we have had to try to fill in gaps in this novel before with what we know from our exposure to various minds. And in this case, based on what we know and have heard and seen about Joe from earlier in the novel, we must try to do it again. Well, as he pursues Joe, Percy Grimm feels, whose name, after all, is a play, I think, on a pun on the Grim Reaper. He feels, as he is pursuing him, as if he is being directed by some supernatural force. Some player, as Faulkner calls it, is moving him across a board in pursuit of Joe, in much the same way that McCurkin felt he was being moved by a divine hand when he pursued Joe to the dance years before. Well, this player that Faulkner describes here, moving Percy Grimm, or that Grimm feels is moving him, is another name, perhaps, for the force of ingrained generations of racist heredity that are propelling Percy Grimm here. And in this respect, we're reminded that Grimm is, in a peculiar way, as much a victim of the past that has created him as Joe Christmas, the man he is pursuing, is a victim of the past that has created him. And you'll note that the two of them are drawn together in this way, in that peculiar scene in which Grimm chases Joe around a cabin, and in which these two counterparts are positioned on opposite sides of it, moving in circles. And here the image of the circle is one of absolute futility and determinism. Neither can escape the orbit of what the past has made them in this absurd circling. Now, the unexpected kinship of these antagonists explains later why Hightower remembers the two men, and as he does, seems to see their faces blended together indistinguishably. Well, after chasing Joe through the woods and around the cabin, as I described, Grimm corners Christmas in Hightower's house in this passage. Grimm turned and ran across the yard and into the house where the old disgraced minister lived alone, and the three men followed him, rushing into the hall. And there, it was upon them, a shameless savageness. Out of it their faces seemed to glare with bodiless suspension, as though from halos as they stooped and raised Hightower, whom Christmas had knocked down. Hightower's face bleeding from the floor, where Christmas, running up the hall, his raised and armed and manacled hands full of glare and glitter like the lightning bolts, so that he resembled a vengeful and furious god pronouncing a doom, had struck Hightower down and then ran. Now, why does Joe go to Hightower's, and why does he strike Hightower? Well, he certainly doesn't go there seeking sanctuary as at Mrs. Hines' urging, as Gavin Stephen claims. That seems extremely unlikely. Even though, ironically, though Joe doesn't know it, Hightower is in fact the only man who could try to defend him. But Joe, of course, doesn't want to be defended, and he doesn't want to be saved. And indeed, it may well be that the reason he attacks and knocks down Hightower is that Hightower has suggested that he would like to lie in order to save him. Indeed, it may be a defiant refusal of that. Joe's final acts are like so many others that define his life, simultaneously self-destructive and acts of bitter defiance of many things. His behavior here is not unlike the defiant gesture of going to a white barber in Mottstown before being apprehended and getting a haircut and a shave. What we find here is his defiance of the white world, his defiance of any sympathy in that white world for blackness, his defiance of religious authority. In striking down Hightower, in a sense, he's striking against all three of those things because Hightower embodies Joe's hatred for whiteness, for a sympathy for blackness, and religious authority. And he does so in knocking Hightower down now once more before he dies. But Hightower's house, of course, it seems, was not likely the intended destination of Joe Christmas as he was running, any more than Mottstown was the initial place where he intended to be apprehended. It's simply the place that he gets to. It is here that, in fact, Joe Christmas does die, where essentially, though he hides behind a table, he surrenders himself to death in that he doesn't fire the gun that he has taken from the officer when he was in custody and he broke away, any more than he fired the gun that he took from Joanna Burton when she had tried to fire it at him. Well, just before the vigilante murder, Hightower tries to save Joe, even though Joe doesn't want saving, by telling Percy Grimm the lie that Byron Bunch has advised. "Men," Hightower cried, "listen to me. He was here that night. He was with me the night of the murder." Well, these are hopeless, empty words. It's too late. And Hightower isn't, after all, speaking to law, or at least any legitimate law, these words. Even though Grimm has been deputized as a concession to his power, the mob that he is leading doesn't care if what Hightower says is true or not, even if, in fact, they believed that Joe Christmas, in fact, was there rather than at Joanna Burton's. It wouldn't matter. They only want to lynch a man because they think that he is black and that he had the temerity to be with a white woman. That is their idea of justice, this scapegoat ritual of lynching a man for the crime of being with a white woman, even the suspicion of it, quite apart from the murder. More disturbing, though, than the killing of Joe Christmas, the firing of the gun, more disturbing is what follows. We're told, after Hightower's cried, "Listen to me, he was here that night," they simply knock him down. We're told, "Has every preacher and old maid in Jefferson taken their pants down to the yell-bellied son of a bitch?" Percy Grimm shouted, and then he flung Hightower, the old man, aside and ran on. It was as though he'd been merely waiting for the player to move him again, because that was the unfailing certitude with which Percy Grimm ran straight to the kitchen and into the doorway, already firing his gun. Grimm emptied the automatic's magazine into that table. Later, someone covered all 5 shots with a folded handkerchief. And when they approached to see what Grimm was about as he approached the body, they saw that the man, Christmas, was not dead yet. And when they saw what Grimm was doing, one of the men gave a choked cry and stumbled back into the hall and began to vomit. Then Grimm, too, sprang back, flinging behind him the bloody butcher knife. "Now you'll let white women alone, even in hell," he said. This is the most horrific moment in the novel. Reverting to the bestial and the primitive, Percy Grimm now castrates and or dismembers Joe Christmas as a tribal punishment for his alleged sex with a white woman. But this horrific act of violence gives way, astonishingly, to an image of peace. Remember, it is peace that Joe Christmas has repeatedly said he wanted all along and knows that he can find only in death. At this moment of death that comes just after he is dismembered while still alive, Faulkner gives us this description. "For a long moment, he looked up at them," Christmas did, with peaceful and unfathomable and unbearable eyes. Then his face, body, all seemed to collapse, to fall in upon itself, and from out the slashed garments about his hips and loins, the pent black blood seemed to rush like a released breath. It seemed to rush out of his pale body like the rush of sparks from a rising rocket. Upon that black blast, the man seemed to rise, soaring into the memories forever and ever. They are not to lose it in whatever peaceful valleys beside whatever placid and reassuring streams of old age, in the mirroring faces of whatever children they will contemplate old disasters and newer hopes. It will be there for these men, musing, quiet and steadfast, not fading and not particularly threatful, but of itself alone serene, of itself triumphant. This look of serene triumph on Joe's face, they will never, even if they try, be able to forget it. Now, Christmas's face looks peaceful as the pent-up blood rushes out of his body, quiet and steadfast, seemingly at rest, serene in the moment of death. It is an image, we're told, that will be stored in the memories of those who have participated in this mob violence and who witnessed the dismemberment. They're haunted, not so much by the dismemberment, though one of the moments, but rather by Joe Christmas's face. That they will never be able to forget, even in their old age. Now, in this sense, in this scene, Faulkner, I think, draws the closest connections between Joe Christmas and his namesake, the crucified Christ. The experience of violent death as a fated self-surrender, the expression of peace on the victim's face as he gives up his spirit, the overflowing of blood from a pale body, the 5 bullet wounds that recall Christ's 5 wounds on the cross, and the way in which the spectacle, we're told, rises soaring in the collective memory of the men who witness it. All of these details, all of these turns of phrase deepen Faulkner's connection of a tormented murderer with the Christian Savior. It's a daring linkage that challenged and vexed the novel's first readers and still has the power to do that today. The expression on Joe's face establishes another linkage, this one, I think, with a woman whom he never meets. Lena Grove is repeatedly described as wearing an expression of peace herself, of calmness and serenity in life, which Joe Christmas seems finally to find this peace in serenity in the release of death. There are other moments when Faulkner provides lines of tenuous connection between these two characters, Joe and Lena, who are antithetical in the ways I've outlined within the novel's contrapunctual structure. Both Joe and Lena are, after all, betrayed by the same man, Lucas Birch. Lena gives birth to her baby in the cabin that Joe has inhabited. And earlier in the novel, when Joe was riding into Mottstown, it was with calm resignation at the knowledge that he would die that recalls the same sense of calm of Lena Grove riding in a similar wagon earlier into the novel, into Jefferson, confident that she will find Lucas Birch. But the most intriguing linkage of all between the two comes through Lena herself. When Mrs. Hines, after the birth, confuses Lena's baby with Joe, Lena, who has never met Joe, nonetheless feels as if somehow she is mixed up with this man in ways that she cannot understand. She explains it to Hightower this way. She says, she keeps on talking about him like his pa was the one in jail, that Mr. Christmas, Lena said. She keeps on, and then I get mixed up, and it's like sometimes I can't, like I'm mixed up too, and I think that his pa is that Mr. Christmas too. She watches as if it was through, make a tremendous effort of some kind, but I know that ain't so. I know it's foolish, but I feel that way. It's a wonderful moment. Lena imagines for a moment that Joe Christmas is the father of her newborn child, a bastard like Joe Christmas himself, that in some strange way she and Joe are mixed up. Now, I do not think that Faulkner is suggesting here a subterranean spiritual connection between Joe and Lena, but rather I think he's suggesting that both of them have imbibed the same cultural and religious traditions that are intermixed in all Southerners, and that there are overlaps in that respect. Intermixed traditions that are far more interwoven among white and black Southerners than whites certainly would like to acknowledge. They are products, if you will, of the same cultural and historical soil, mixed together. Now, Faulkner devotes the penultimate chapter of Light in August to Hightower, whom we see bandaged after Joe's assault on him with the pistol butt. We see Hightower afterwards sitting by his window, as he does each evening, and now reflecting on his life with a greater candor than he ever has before. This provides the opportunity, this self-reflection, for Faulkner to fill in, at last, Hightower's family history and his childhood, just as Faulkner has already supplied the childhoods of Lena and Joe and Joanna Burden. All of them had troubled childhoods, and Hightower is no exception. Lena's parents died, sending her to her brothers as a girl. Joe never knew his parents, and Hightower, we learn, was an orphan in another sense. His mother died when he was a boy, and his father, who was 50 when he was born, was so distant a parent that Hightower never really knew him. Raised largely, like Faulkner, by the family's black housekeeper, who once worked for Hightower's grandfather, Hightower becomes obsessed with that ancestor, after whom he is named, Gale Hightower, obsessed with that ancestor, especially in his early childhood, when he opens a trunk that contains the grandfather's gray Confederate uniform, the uniform in which that hard-drinking grandfather was shot to death after a bold, grandiose raid on one of General Grant's storage facilities in the then Union-occupied town of Jefferson. This fascinated obsessively the young Gale Hightower. He opened the trunk. It opened, tumbling slowly. To him, the child, it seemed unbelievably huge, as though made for a giant, as though merely from having been worn by one of them, the cloth itself of the uniform had assumed the properties of those phantoms who loomed heroic and tremendous against a background of thunder and smoke and torn flags which now filled Gale's waking and sleeping life. Yes, patches of Confederate gray on the uniform, weathered, leaf-blown now, and one that stopped its very heart. It was blue, dark blue, the blue of the United States. Looking at this patch at the mute and anonymous cloth, the boy, the child born into the autumn of his mother's and father's lives, whose organs already required the unflagging care of a Swiss watch, could experience a kind of hushed and triumphant terror, which left him a little bit sick. The fact that Hightower's grandfather died shortly after this heroic, if futile, raid, when he was shot trying to steal a chicken, that seemingly ignominious fact does not in the least diminish the irresistible splendor of this ancestor in the boy's imagination. Indeed, the blue patch, that strange and seemingly incongruous blue Union patch over a bullet hole in the Confederate uniform, is a source of mystery that preys upon Hightower's imagination. How did it get there? Did he kill a Union soldier and put it there? What caused it? He's consumed with curiosity, a curiosity and an imaginative fascination that overrides the rather tawdry way in which the grandfather actually died. This boy, born into the autumn of his mother's and father's life, creates his grandfather in the absolutely unalterable halo of splendor that his imagination demands. Even the fact that he's shot stealing chickens is, in Hightower's youthful imagination, a kind of marvelous distinction. We're told that any soldier can be killed by the enemy in the heat of battle by a weapon approved by arbiters, rule makers of warfare, only, however, to be shot by a woman in a bedroom, and not with a shotgun, but with a fowling piece in a henhouse. That's a mark of distinction. That sets him apart right there. Well, as a neglected boy, Hightower asks his black nanny, whose husband served under Hightower's grandfather, again and again to tell me again about Grandpa. How many Yankees did he kill? Hightower remains so haunted, exhilarated by this family mythology that it drives him eventually to Jefferson, where the deed of great glamour occurred. But even though Hightower would like to deny it, the fact is that his inheritance, his cultural inheritance, his blood inheritance, doesn't derive simply from his grandfather. He also inherits strains from his distant father, who, though he pays little attention to Hightower, nonetheless is in his blood. The father, who served in the Civil War both as a sober-minded cleric and as a self-taught doctor. In short, served in the war on the Confederate side by ministering to mind and body. And Hightower has also assimilated his father's abolitionist beliefs. Even though he served in the war, his father was at heart an abolitionist. So Hightower's own sympathy then for African Americans and his own laborers, first as a preacher and then as a deliverer of children from a textbook, all of these are reflections of his heritage from his father, a heritage that absolutely counters what he seems to have absorbed both in his blood and in his mind and in his bones and instincts from his Confederate grandfather. Thus, there's a kind of inner conflict bound up within his own heredity. But note that it is not his father that Hightower feels drawn to consciously. Having regarded his father as nothing more than a living phantom, when he was a child, he saw his long-dead grandfather as a much more compelling, fascinating, and living ghost. We're told that he never tired of listening to the nanny's stories. This child with rapt, wide, half dread and half delight, and the old woman musing with savage, sorrowful pride about the past. But this to the child was just peaceful shuddering of delight. He found no terror in the knowledge that his grandfather of the country had killed men by the hundreds, as he was told and as he believed. No, for him there was something simple and warm and heroic about it. Because, after all, no horror here because they were just ghosts, never seen in the flesh. And yet, even though there is, after all, no sense of actual bloodshed, they are removed in that sense, but immediate in the sense that the image of the grandfather is always with the young Hightower and is more vivid and compelling than anything in his present world as a boy, or certainly anything in his father. Now, note that as a young man then, Hightower felt that the passionate glory of his grandfather had, quote, skipped a generation, that passionate glory was alive in him. But, like Joe Christmas, Hightower's heritage is more complex and contradictory, as I've already suggested, than he wanted to believe. His gravitation to the legend of his grandfather and his sense of it as his own destiny somehow reminds us that the lives of Joe Christmas and Joanna Burton and Gail Hightower are all, to some degree, determined by the influences of their grandfathers, men whom they never knew, but nonetheless had shaped their lives. Now, one of the earliest and most interesting psychoanalytic studies of this pattern of fascination with the grandfather in Faulkner comes from the critic John Irwin, who offers this explanation of the grandfather fixation in Light and August and throughout Faulkner's fiction. The custom of naming children after their grandfathers, as Hightower is named after his, is extremely widespread in both civilized and uncivilized races. Among many, it is not merely a common habit, but an invariable rule. Indeed, there are primitive peoples who believe that the grandfather has returned in the person of the child, the grandson. The psychologist Ernest Jones suggests that the principal origin of the reversal fantasy is the belief in personal immortality. Neither the child's mind nor the adult unconscious can apprehend the idea of personal annihilation, and thus the child tries to deny the idea that he will ever die by imagining that he somehow has reincarnated the grandfather, and that the grandfather, therefore, himself has never died. Well, it may well be that Hightower is trying to deny his mortality or mortality in general as a young man by sensing that he has re-embodied the spirit of his grandfather and by bringing the grandfather to life in his imagination again and again as a figure of, quote, eternal youth. At least he did this when he was very young. But as an old man, as we find him now in the novel, his continued fixation on this legendary galloping grandfather has less to do with some desire to believe in immortality or to deny his own mortality than it is a reflection of the old Hightower's desire to escape time, to negate temporality of all, to negate change by retreating into a life of absolute cloistered stasis. Now, as a man recently married, we're told, on the train to Jefferson with his new wife, Hightower bombarded her with this vision of his ancestors' heroism, almost to the point of distraction. That grandfather wore no sword, galloped with no sword, waving in front of the rest of them, performing with the grim levity of schoolboys a prank so foolhardy that the troops who had opposed them for 4 years did not believe they would have even attempted it. So daring was this raid on the headquarters, on the depot. I have never seen it, Hightower said, but I know exactly how it will look, Jefferson. I know exactly how the house that we will someday own and live in on the street, I know exactly what it will look like. That same air will be there, that same dust and mud, somehow as it was for my grandfather. This is beautiful. Listen to me. Try to see it. Here is the fine shape of the eternal youth and virginal desire which makes heroes. He's convinced that whatever emanation of his grandfather went out in this exploit, it somehow is still preserved in the atmosphere of Jefferson, and that is drawing him there, drawing him back to this place. Now, Hightower's preoccupation with the past, his familial past, poisons his sermons and alienates his wife. But in order to nourish this vision, Hightower, both as a young minister and also as an old man, experiences one of the novel's most extreme forms of cognitive dissonance. It's this: Hightower must simultaneously support, as he does, the advancement of the Negro race, as his father had, and at the same time glorify the heroism of an ancestor who fought, the grandfather, in defense of slavery. And Hightower feels a compulsion to share this vision of his grandfather with anyone who will listen, including his wife and his congregation, glorifying it while at the same time, for the most part, defying the racism of his community. When he speaks to his congregation, he asks them to envision this. You can feel it. Here in the darkness, horses pulled up short, plunging, clashes of arms, whispers over loud, hard breathing. The voice is still triumphant. Behind them, the rest of the troops galloping past the rallying bugles. That you must hear, feel. That you must see. He says this to his wife. He says this to his congregation. He alienates both of them. Well, as Hightower sits by his window after Joe Christmas's death, he reflects again on this past habit of his. He hears again the beat of the horse's hooves, but now, having been brought back to life after 25 years of hermetic solitude, Hightower realizes how damaging his pursuit of this Confederate family fantasy has been on his life. And he is now, for the first time, consumed with guilt for entertaining it. It's not just the guilt for which he has atoned for 25 years, the loss of his congregation and his failures as a husband. He certainly feels guilt for that, and the family fantasy has contributed to both of those things. But Hightower's examination of conscience now takes him into a deeper understanding of his failures. He understands that in becoming a Presbyterian minister, he, quote, acquiesced to a religion, not, quote, of ecstasy and passion, but a religion of abjuration, threat, and doom. In short, he acquiesced to becoming a minister in a Calvinist creed, which, as we have seen, Hightower already denounces as a religion of hatred and violence and death. But now he charges himself with guilt for having agreed to practice that religion just so he could get back to Jefferson. Why? Because by attending a seminary, he felt he could find his way back to Jefferson, which would be one of the places he could become a minister. Now, as poisonous as the religion itself is, a religion that Hightower has cast off as an orthodoxy, Hightower also realizes that his entire ministry in it was fraudulent from the start. He used his training as a cleric to leverage his way into Jefferson and then baffled his flock with misguided sermons about his family past that were mere narcissistic exercises. He seems to see them reflected. A figure he was, an antic showman, a little wild in the pulpit, a charlatan preaching worse than heresy, in utter disregard of that whose very stage he preempted, offering the congregation instead of the crucified shape of pity and love, a swaggering and unchastened bravo killed with a shotgun in a peaceful henhouse. Instead of the image and example of Christ, what he offers them is a kind of apotheosis of the heroism of this Confederate grandfather who was killed when he tried to raid a henhouse. Now, Hightower realizes that his 2 decades of atonement have ignored this more grievous sin of practicing a religion of death and hate and of lying to himself and others about why he even entered that religion. Well, when he was expelled from the church, Hightower now admits to himself he is guilty of another sin. Then he was guilty, he now realizes, of playing the role of a martyr. That too was a lie, however, because secretly Hightower celebrated the expulsion, knowing that he could not only conceive of himself as a victim and a martyr, but that by being banished, he could then retreat entirely into the imaginary past. He could then isolate himself in his house and live in a fantasy as he had secretly wanted to live in a fantasy in Jefferson from the start. Thus, the smile a photographer captures on Hightower's hypocritical face behind the hymnal that he's holding in front of it, who's being led out of church after his dismissal, suggests that private satisfaction of getting what he wants, but all under the guise of martyrdom and all under the guise of being forced out, making it appear that he resigned his pulpit for a martyr's reasons, when at the very instant there was within Hightower a leaping and triumphant surge of denial behind a face which had betrayed him, believing itself safe behind the lifted hymn book when the photographer pressed the bulb. He seems to watch himself now, alert, patient, skillful, playing his cards well, making it appear that he was being driven uncomplaining into that which he did not even then admit had been his desire since before he entered the seminary, but which Hightower, now looking back, recognizes and feels a crushing burden of guilt for. In short, Hightower knows he spent 25 years atoning for his failures to his congregation and to his young wife, but only now does he come to understand what he has not atoned for but should. Only now does he allow himself to see the full measure of his guilt toward the community and also toward his wife. Because we learn that having initially idealized the woman's purity, the way almost a Proustian lover would, and having superimposed that notion of purity upon his wife, Hightower remains with her, even after he realizes the falseness of that conception, even after it becomes clear to him that she has sexual and emotional needs of a woman, he describes as blind and headlong with passion. And the reason he does not break off his relation with her before they are married is because he believes that she can help him get to Jefferson, just as he believed by becoming a Presbyterian minister he could get back there. Thus, he ignores his wife's emotional and sexual needs when they are married, and even more after they arrive in Jefferson, the point of desired arrival. Thus, Hightower realizes more fully than he ever had before how his egotism drove his wife desperately to other men, and how he is, quote, murderer, author, and instrument of her shame and death, by ignoring from the very beginning what he saw in her, the needs he saw in her, but which he refused in any way to act upon. So great was his egocentric desire to use her as a vehicle to get to Jefferson. Quote, you took her as a means toward your own selfishness, Hightower tells himself. This new self-honesty brings such self-recrimination that at the end of these reveries, stricken with guilt that he has never before recognized and not yet atoned for, having just come back to life, Hightower now feels in this state of agonized recognition. He feels at this moment as if he is dying. Then it seems to him that some ultimate damned flood within him breaks and rushes away. He seems to watch it, feeling himself losing contact with earth, lighter and lighter, emptying, floating. I am dying, he thinks. I should pray. I should try to pray. But he does not. He does not try. He hears above his heart the thunder increase, myriad and drumming. Like a long sighing of wind in trees it begins, and then they sweep into sight, borne now upon a cloud of phantom dust. They rush past, forward-leaning in their saddles, with brandished arms beneath whipping ribbons that slanted in eager lances. With tumult and soundless yelling they sweep past like a tide. Yet leaning forward in the window, his bandaged head huge and without depth above the twin blobs of his hands upon the ledge, it seems to him that he still hears them, the wild bugles, the clashing sabers, and the dying thunder of hooves. Well, this is the most notoriously ambiguous scene in all of Light in August. After this, we do not see Hightower again, and that begs the question even more, what exactly is happening here in the last instant in which we do see him? Well, some critics have argued that Hightower actually is dying, and we get, in this description, the final vision of his expiring consciousness, which is a fading vision of those hooves of his grandfather in his conception of his long-standing glory. Others have suggested that the force of Hightower's guilt now is so great that it is driving him into a state of insanity in which he has somehow lost his ability to distinguish between the images in his mind and imagination and the blob-like objects, his hand on the windowsill, that this is a description not of death but of a kind of mental breakdown. Still others read the ending as an evidence of Hightower's ironic retreat as he hears again these hoofbeats, of his ironic retreat back from the world into which he has finally emerged, back into the destructive world of his historical family fantasy, the fantasy that drew him to Jefferson and has corrupted his life and filled him with such guilt, that this becomes a kind of escape in the face of guilt that is so overwhelming that he feels that he can never actually atone for it. Well, the problem is, if this latter development is true, this retreat from life, then it nullifies what we have seen in the previous chapters. Hightower's brief return to life, Hightower's ethical action, and Hightower's apparent ability to cast off the imprisoning force of his family history that has kept him housebound and isolated for so many years. Fortunately, I don't think that Hightower dies, nor do I think he is going insane, nor do I think he is merely retreating in a kind of self-protective way back into his nightly fantasy of the Civil War past. Rather, I think Francois Picovet is leading us to something illuminating and productive when he quotes Faulkner's response to questions about the ending of this chapter and what is happening to Hawthorne. And in meditating upon Faulkner's remarks, Picovet offers a sensible and hopeful assessment. Faulkner asked what was happening. Was it madness? Was it death? Was it retreat with Hightower? He said, no, he didn't die. Hightower had wrecked his life. He had failed his wife. He had failed himself. But there was one thing that he still had, which was the brave grandfather that galloped into the town to burn the Yankee stores. And at least he had that. He had to endure to live, but that was the one thing that was pure and fine that he had, was the memory of his grandfather who had been brave. Picovet then observes, so it appears that Hightower carried on living, according to Faulkner, with a vision that was no longer sterile, but was now an image of courage, say in the spirit of Shakespeare's Henry IV, rather than of Tennyson, whom he reads. He observes that Hightower falls back on his vision of the past, but it is now a dynamic vision, and perhaps now he is able to see it less as a retreat from life and more as an encouragement to help him endure whatever life remains with a better grace than he's had before. His vision has at last become liberating rather than imprisoning. Well, I don't know about you, but I personally am happy to go with this affirmative reading in the face of ambiguity and in the face of so much bleak determinism elsewhere within this novel. Now, this leaves us with Faulkner's wonderfully comic and humane final chapter, a coda that comes to us through the voice of the furniture dealer who picks up Lena and Byron on the road in his truck and drives them to Tennessee with stops along the way. This first-person narrator tells the story looking back as he's lying in bed with his young wife, and he tells it in a mood of compassionate understanding, ribald humor, and erotic joy. He reports that the couple, quote, never said they were going where they were going and didn't even know themselves. Now, this is because Byron and Lena can't decide whether they should pursue Lucas Birch, or just remain together. The salesman is struck by the fact that Lena is young and strapping and beautiful as she nurses her insatiably hungry infant, while Byron is small and older and rather puny. As the furniture dealer says, he was the kind of fellow you wouldn't notice if he was by himself alone in the bottom of a concrete swimming pool. Great image. Watching Byron with Lena, he sees that there was something he wants to do and is scared to do. Now, when the furniture dealer's wife asks him what it is that Byron wanted to do but was afraid to do, his response is, maybe I'll show you too, which makes it clear that Byron, having come to see Lena as sexual, is now himself sexually and powerfully aroused by her, okay? In short, he wants desperately to marry her, or at very least to enjoy her ravishing Earth Mother body. That's what he wants to ask, but can't quite get around to asking. Well, the furniture dealer overhears Joe propose to Lena yet again, once again without encouragement, but he detects something that Byron does not see. As Byron is speaking to her and importuning her to marry him, he detects a smile on Lena's face. Describes the scene that he is sort of voyeuristically watching this way. So I heard him talking to her about how they might travel on like this from one truck to another and one state to another for the rest of their lives and not find any trace of Lucas Birch, and they sitting there on the hog, holding the chap and listening quiet as a stone and pleasant as a stone and just about as nigh as being moved or persuaded as a stone was she. Well, he hadn't even mentioned marriage, neither, but that's what he was talking about, and her listening placid and calm like she'd heard it before, and she knew that she never even had to bother to say either yes or no to him, smiling a little as she was, but he couldn't see that, couldn't see her smiling. Then he gave up. He got up from the log and walked away, but I saw his face when he turned, and I knew he hadn't given up. I knew that he had just give up one more chance, and that now he had got himself desperate up to risking it all. Again, making it clear where he stands, essentially not getting any encouragement, going away, but never giving up. The furniture dealer understands this. Indeed, when, having gone away briefly, Byron returns, he climbs into the wagon next to Lena, and he makes a clumsy sexual advance, both out of his own erotic need, but also probably because he wonders whether this is what he must do in order to try to win her. Seemed to work for Lucas Birch. Well, when Lena boots him out, of course, he realizes this is not the way to proceed. "Why, Mr. Bunch, ain't you ashamed? You might have woke the baby, too." And then he come out of the back door of the truck, not fast and not climbing down on his own legs at all. I'd be a dog if I don't believe she picked him up and set him back outside on the ground like she would that baby if it had been about 6 years old, and she says, "You go and lay down there now and get some sleep. We got another fur piece to go tomorrow." Byron is so humiliated by Lena's silences and by this treatment that he disappears again into the night, only to return, as he has so often, on the road again the next day, and Lena, of course, knew that he would. And for this return, he finally receives from Lena something like the encouragement that points toward their future together. A future, you remember, that even though he opposed the Union, Hightower at one point saw, envisioned, almost prophetically. Thus, we're told, that he had done desperated himself up then for the last time to take the last chance, and now he knew he would never be at desperate again. And yet, of course, he's back. He continues, and he come round the back of it, again the wagon had stood there, and her not even surprised. "I done come too far now," he says. "I'd be a dog if I'm going to quit now." And her looking at him like she had known all the time that he was going to do before he ever knew himself that he was going to do it, and that whatever he done, he wasn't going to mean it. "Ain't nobody never said for you to quit," she said. I think she's just traveling. Okay, that's what I think about her. I don't think she had any idea of finding whoever it was that she was following. I don't think she ever aimed to, only she hadn't yet told him yet. And I think she just made up her mind to travel a little further and see as much as she could, since I reckon she knew that when she settled down this time, it would likely be for the rest of her life. That's what I think. Once she decides that the two of them are going to settle down, as she's now encouraged him to believe when she says, after all, nobody ever said for you to quit. Knowing she's going to settle down, she wants to travel before that. Now, note that just as Lena endures, so too she values Byron's endurance, his persistence. Perhaps understandably, having been abandoned twice by another man, she's reluctant to become involved. But at the same time, having been abandoned by another man twice, she recognizes the virtue of Byron's steadfastness, his indefatigable commitment to her. But why does she put him off so long if she has, as the furniture dealer suggests, given up on ever finding Birch, and if she knows that Byron is a kind of devoted, reliable man that he is, and that Birch never was? Well, it's not that she's testing him. No, She sees what he is. Rather, the salesman suggests quite plausibly that Lena has simply made up her mind to travel, and she wants to enjoy traveling before she says finally yes to Byron, as it appears she certainly at some point will, because she knew that when she settled down this time it would likely be for the rest of her life. Well, it seems to be an altogether more plausible and reliable assessment of the situation than what we got earlier from Gavin Stevens with regard to Joe Christmas. And in a profoundly bleak novel, Lena's agency here, the desire for movement and travel, the ability to decide to marry Byron when she wants, and the hopeful vision of their life together in the future that is hinted at, produces, I think, a kind of comic joy that makes the ending of Light and August quite unexpectedly one of the happiest we find in any major Faulkner novel. I think perhaps the least profoundly bleak in a novel that is so otherwise darkly deterministic. At the end of Absalom, for example, Quentin Compson rushes out into the New England winter night crying, "I don't hate the South, I don't," only to kill himself months later because he hates the South and himself so much. But the inexhaustible Lena and the endlessly persistent Byron endure, resisting death and embracing life together as they move through time and space down the road. In a novel that has repeatedly circled in time and in space, the book's final lines bring us back to the very beginning of the novel when Lena was on the road and had just crossed from Alabama into Mississippi. We find us circling back to that now. And now we find, echoing the beginning of the novel, that they're crossing another border. "Here comes Salisbury," she says. "What?" says I. "Salisbury, Tennessee." And I looked back and saw her face, and it was like it was already fixed and waiting to be surprised, and that she knew that when the surprise comes, she was going to enjoy it. And it did come, and it did suit her, because she said, my, a body does get around. Here we ain't been coming from Alabama but 2 months, and now it's already Tennessee." Well, as they cross this border, we're reminded again, as we circle back, that there are certain circles in this novel that are absurd and reflect a kind of futility and determinism and pointlessness, mainly described by Joe Christmas, but that this is not an absurd circle that leads us back to the very beginning. Rather, there has been a cycle of progress in Lena Grove's life. She is a mother, she is with the man who it appears she will marry, and she's moved from Alabama to Mississippi, and now all the way on to Tennessee. With that, we end. I hope to see you all in the fall, okay? Take care.